Hello, welcome to 4 or 5 Minutes Closer to God. My name is Doug. So, what you been up to? I've been moving and preparing to move, sell a house, and also have had a heart procedure and ablation to help my irregular heartbeat. And so I've been recovering from both those and working 120 miles away from home. So that poses some time constraints. But today I wanted to talk about the Magnalia Dei. That's the mighty acts of God. So in the Old Testament, we have the Exodus, Moses leading the people out of Egypt. But he did so by the power of God taking on the gods of Egypt. So each of the 10 plagues was a putting down of a particular god. And so we get 1 through 10, the 10th one being Pharaoh himself, and the God-man type person that a Pharaoh was, and his firstborn being taken from him. And so when they left and went through the Red Sea and crossed over to the Promised Land and were delayed there for 40 years, they would remember the mighty acts of God on their behalf. And so throughout the Old Testament, we get those mighty acts being portrayed. So in the New Testament, the mighty act of God is Jesus. He is the Word made flesh, and his death, burial, and resurrection and ultimate ascension is our touchstone for a mighty act of God on our behalf. The shed blood of Christ is more powerful than any other force in the universe, and so we have our depictions of Jesus on the cross, this mighty act of God to humble himself and bleed and die, and then have his body put into the tomb, and then on the third day rise again. And what a mighty act that is. Jesus raising himself and God raising him as well. And then we have his ascension to the right hand of God those days later. So Jesus, in rocketing up through the clouds, was showing his power over the air. And who is the prince of the power of the air? So we have Jesus in the New Testament being laid out on a cross, an old rugged cross as the song goes. And so we've seen many depictions of that, rooted in the ground and truthfully, historically factual. The Shroud of Turin exhibits the idea that this man did something amazing by essentially flashing that shrouded cloth with his resurrection power. And so we get an image of what it was like for Christ to break back from the dead. But what he had done in his life was to defeat the gods of the nations there. So he walked on water, and he rose from the dead. He defeated death. He performed miracles. He unstopped the blind eyes and ears and made the lame to walk. And so we have Jesus in his resurrection showing the power over death, but we also have him on the cross showing that he passed through death and conquered it. Then Salvador Dali has given us a painting that represents a kind of a transcendent metaphysical Jesus, the power of Jesus elevated into the fourth dimension. So it's called Christus or Corpus Hypercubus, and that relays the power of God in the spiritual dimension, so that he is lifted up not only on a three-dimensional cross, but the unfolding of a hypercube into three-dimensional space. And Jesus is there, kind of lifted up and ascending above the ground in a way that presents Jesus as this extra dimensional being in the way that God is. And so I have termed that in the past the pneuma dimension, the spiritual dimension, and Jesus in Salvador Dali's painting is lifted up off the ground in a way that brings a whole different insight into the nature of the death and resurrection of Jesus.